The neighborhood had been designed to look perfect, or at least that was the story the brochures had promised when families first bought into it. Rows of nearly identical houses lined up like soldiers on parade, each with manicured lawns trimmed to the exact same length, each painted in an approved palette of beige, cream, or off-white. To the Homeowners Association, uniformity was not just preferred, it was sacred. It gave them control, it gave them power, and it let them look down at anyone who dared to deviate. For months, the homeowner had stared at the peeling beige paint on his two-story house. The sun had baked it, the rain had streaked it, and the years had drained it of anything resembling life. The house didn't look inviting. It looked like every other tired house on the block. Beige upon beige, bland upon bland. It wasn't just boring, it was suffocating. But in the middle of this monotony, he had a different vision. He imagined a house that stood out instead of blending in. A house that looked alive, colorful, unapologetically bright in a world that tried so hard to dim individuality. He wanted vibrancy, not rules, and he decided that if the HOA demanded beige, he would give them the exact opposite. The first notice came casually, slipped into his mailbox on an ordinary weekday morning. It was worded with the kind of cold politeness only HOA boards seemed to master. It reminded him that all homeowners were required to repaint their houses every certain number of years, and it stated firmly that only approved neutral colors could be used. To the HOA, it was just another round of enforcement, another reminder of their grip on the neighborhood. To him, it was an opportunity. He bought buckets of paint, but not the kind they expected. He didn't buy beige. He didn't even buy white or cream. Instead, he filled his garage with cans of vibrant reds, sunny yellows, ocean blues, grassy greens, and bright purples. He collected enough shades to build a rainbow, enough tones to paint joy itself across the face of a suburban house. He was not going to comply, he was going to rebel. On a Saturday morning, while most neighbors were still sipping their coffee and checking their email, he opened the first can of paint. A streak of deep crimson slashed across the beige siding, bright and loud against the monotone neighborhood. By midday, yellow was spread across the trim, followed by blue on the shutters. He worked tirelessly, brushstroke after brushstroke, turning conformity into chaos or art, depending on who looked at it. The neighbors noticed. Some stood outside pretending to water their lawns while staring. Some peeked from behind their blinds, whispering over their shoulders to their spouses. Some took photos, posting them in neighborhood group chats with captions that mixed outrage and disbelief. The HOA president, a woman who had lived for years in the biggest beige house on the corner, was one of the first to storm over to witness the transformation. By Sunday evening, the house was unrecognizable. Stripes of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple climbed from the ground to the roofline, each color carefully layered and balanced. Against the backdrop of identical beige houses, it was like a lighthouse in a sea of sameness. Some children clapped their hands and pointed. Some neighbors frowned so deeply they looked like they'd aged 10 years in a day. The HOA sent a second notice. This one wasn't casual. It was stern, carrying threats of fines and mandatory repainting. They cited rules, bylaws, and penalties. But the homeowner didn't care. He stood in his driveway, paint roller still dripping with bright blue, looking at his house with pride. To him, it wasn't just a home anymore, it was a statement. The following week, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. Their agenda wasn't subtle. The Rainbow House, as they had started to call it, had become the talk of the entire subdivision. Some claimed it lowered property values. Some claimed it was disrespectful to the neighborhood. Others whispered quietly that it was beautiful, that it was brave, that it was exactly the kind of color the community needed. The president of the HOA, however, saw no beauty in it. She saw only defiance. She paced in front of her beige podium during the meeting, flipping through pages of violation codes. She promised the board that the house would be repainted, that the rebellion would not stand. She described it as a cancer on the community, something that would spread if not cut out quickly. But even as she said it, the board knew the situation was slipping beyond their control. Because by then, photos of the Rainbow House weren't just circulating in neighborhood group chats. They were appearing online. A teenager walking his dog had snapped a wide shot and posted it to social media with the caption, "Someone just declared war on Beige." Within hours, the photo was shared thousands of times. By the end of the weekend, local news outlets had picked it up. A drone shot of the house appeared on the evening news, framed as a quirky suburban rebellion against strict HOA rules. The homeowner didn't plan for fame. He simply wanted to live in a house that felt like his own, a house that reflected who he was. But fame had arrived anyway, and with it came both allies and enemies. Cars started slowing down in front of his street. Some drivers rolled down their windows to cheer. Others shook their heads in disapproval. Local radio stations joked about the HOA's nightmare. One morning show even hosted a poll asking listeners, "Team Beige or Team Rainbow?" The HOA president grew angrier with every headline. She didn't just want the house repainted. Now she wanted the homeowner punished, humiliated, forced into submission. She printed out pages of angry emails from other residents, highlighting phrases like eyesore, disgrace, and ruining our property values. She carried them around like ammunition, ready to unleash them at the next hearing. But what she didn't realize was that for every neighbor who disapproved, there were two more who secretly admired the Rainbow House. Some were tired of the beige monotony themselves. Some saw the house as a symbol of freedom, a challenge to an HOA that had ruled them too tightly for too long. They didn't dare say it out loud, but they hoped the homeowner would keep standing his ground. As weeks passed, the battle lines grew clearer. On one side, the HOA and its president fueled by outrage and armed with rulebooks. On the other, the homeowner and a growing group of quiet supporters, fueled by pride and emboldened by the viral attention. The Rainbow House had become more than paint on wood. It had become a fight for control, a clash between conformity and individuality. The first fines arrived. The HOA mailed them in thick envelopes, each one stating the amount owed and the deadline for payment. The numbers grew larger each week, climbing into hundreds, then thousands. The homeowner stacked them on his kitchen counter like trophies. He knew they were meant to intimidate him, to drain his resolve. Instead, they only strengthened it. Every new fine was proof that his house had struck a nerve. And still the house shone. Under the morning sun, the colors gleamed like stained glass. At dusk, the setting sun painted them with golden light. Even at night, street lamps caught the hues, reflecting them softly onto the sidewalk. Neighbors whispered about how children begged their parents to walk by the Rainbow House just to see it again. Tourists from nearby towns began driving through the subdivision, slowing down for photos. The HOA president despised it all. By the end of the month, the HOA filed a formal complaint. They announced they would be taking the homeowner to court. Their argument was that the Rainbow House violated community standards, diminished property values, and disrespected the neighborhood's rules. They believed that in court, their bylaws would prevail and the rainbow would be forced back into beige. The homeowner didn't flinch. He hired an attorney, gathered screenshots of online praise, and prepared for the fight. He knew this was bigger than paint. This was about standing up to an HOA that thought it could control everything, from the color of a house to the spirit of the people living inside it. The court date was set. The HOA president celebrated quietly, convinced she had the upper hand. But outside her beige walls, the story was spreading further. News stations announced the upcoming case. Social media buzzed with anticipation. Commentators called it the Beige vs. Rainbow showdown. And as the day drew closer, more and more people began to see the Rainbow House not as a problem, but as a symbol worth defending. The HOA believed they were about to crush one man's rebellion. What they didn't realize was that the rebellion had already grown into something far larger than they could control. And with that, the stage was set, not just for a court battle, but for the neighborhood to finally choose between beige conformity and rainbow individuality. The weeks leading up to the court date transformed the neighborhood into something it had never been before. It was no longer just a quiet, uniform enclave of beige homes and manicured lawns. It had become the epicenter of a cultural standoff that reached far beyond its fences. What began as one man's defiance against paint regulations was now a headline across town, then across the state, and finally across the internet. The Rainbow House had become a landmark, Cars slowed to take pictures. Bloggers wrote think pieces about suburban conformity. Local news crews filmed segments in front of the glowing stripes of paint. What had once been a quiet suburban street was now a tourist stop, a photo backdrop, and a symbol of individuality. The HOA saw it as a humiliation. The homeowner saw it as vindication. Inside the beige fortress of her house, the HOA president stewed in anger. Each new article, each viral photo, each supportive comment online was another insult. She wasn't simply fighting against a violation of rules anymore. She felt she was fighting for her authority, her reputation, her very identity as the enforcer of order. She had spent years cultivating a reputation as the guardian of neighborhood standards, the gatekeeper of taste. And now, because of one rainbow house, her control was slipping. The HOA board met weekly, sometimes even more often, crafting their strategy. They pored over bylaws, highlighted clauses, and circled phrases they believed would sway a judge. They built binders full of photos, showing the eyesore house towering over beige homes like an unwanted carnival attraction. They gathered letters from residents who claimed their property values were in danger, though many were written under pressure rather than genuine outrage. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Not every board member shared the president's zeal. Some whispered doubts, wondering if the attention was making them look worse than the rainbow house itself. Some admitted privately that they liked the color, though they would never dare say it publicly. Yet, despite the doubt, the president's will dominated the room. They would go to court, she declared, and they would win. The homeowner, on the other hand, prepared differently. His attorney advised him to gather community support, to demonstrate that the rainbow house wasn't a nuisance, but an asset. And support was not hard to find. Families who loved visiting the house volunteered to testify. Neighbors who secretly admired the colors agreed to sign petitions. Even strangers from other neighborhoods offered letters praising the house as a joyful landmark. As the court date approached, the story grew even bigger. Morning talk shows invited local guests to debate whether HOAs had too much power. News outlets replayed drone footage of the rainbow house as if it were a piece of art. And social media, with its endless appetite for spectacle, rallied behind the homeowner. Memes appeared comparing Team Beige and Team Rainbow, complete with t-shirts and hashtags. What the HOA thought would be a straightforward legal battle had turned into a cultural war. When the day finally came, the courthouse steps were crowded. Reporters with microphones jostled for space, camera crews set up live feeds, and onlookers gathered as though attending a parade. The homeowner arrived calmly, wearing neutral clothes that contrasted with the vibrant house he defended. The HOA president arrived stiff and severe, clutching her binder of rules like it was a weapon. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. On one side sat the HOA board, their faces tense and rigid. On the other sat the homeowner and his small group of supporters, who carried themselves with quiet confidence. The judge presided with an air of authority, clearly aware that this case was no ordinary neighborhood dispute. The HOA presented their argument first. They described the rainbow house as disruptive, claiming it destroyed the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood and lowered property values. They read aloud from bylaws that restricted non-neutral colors, pointing to the rainbow stripes as blatant violations. They framed the homeowner as reckless, disrespectful, and dangerous to community order. Their attorney spoke with passion, but also with a hint of desperation. They relied heavily on the authority of the HOA, believing that rules were rules, and that was enough. They did not account for the fact that the courtroom was not bound by their bylaws alone. It was bound by the law. When it was the homeowner's turn, his attorney rose with quiet composure. He acknowledged the rules but argued that the HOA's interpretation was overly strict and oppressive. He presented evidence of community support, including signatures, letters, and photos of smiling children posing in front of the rainbow house. He showed online posts from thousands of people praising the house as a work of art. He argued that the HOA's definition of neutral was outdated and arbitrary, and that the house did not diminish property values, but rather increased interest in the community. The turning point came when a local real estate agent testified. She explained that far from hurting property values, The attention surrounding the Rainbow House had increased inquiries about the neighborhood. Homes in the area were now selling faster because of the publicity. Buyers were curious about the community that hosted such a unique landmark. The HOA's argument collapsed in real time. By the time closing statements were made, the contrast was clear. The HOA appeared rigid, controlling, and unwilling to bend. The homeowner appeared reasonable, creative, and supported by both neighbors and strangers alike. The judge did not rule immediately, but the tone in the courtroom suggested the momentum had shifted. Outside, the waiting crowd buzzed with speculation. Reporters interviewed both sides, capturing soundbites that would play on evening broadcasts. The homeowner spoke softly about individuality and freedom. The HOA president snapped about rules and standards. The contrast was stark, and public opinion continued to tilt against her. In the days that followed, the case became national news. Major networks covered it. Editorials debated it. The Rainbow House was no longer just a local story. It was a symbol of resistance against conformity. It represented the clash between individuality and authority, creativity and control. The HOA president, however, refused to accept defeat. She doubled down, sending out angry newsletters to the community, warning of dire consequences if the house was allowed to remain. She painted visions of chaos, purple houses, neon lawns, streets turned into carnival sideshows. She insisted she was protecting the future of the neighborhood, but her words rang hollow, especially as more and more neighbors began to resent her heavy-handed tactics. Meanwhile, the homeowner thrived. He welcomed visitors who came to admire the house, often handing out small prints of photographs taken against the rainbow background. He hosted small gatherings, celebrating the colors with neighbors who felt liberated by his defiance. The Rainbow House became not just a home, but a community hub, a place where people came to feel joy in a neighborhood that had long been stifled. When the judge's decision finally came, it was both decisive and humiliating for the HOA. The court ruled that while HOAs had authority to regulate appearances, they could not enforce rules that were overly vague or unreasonable. The definition of neutral colors, as written in the bylaws, was deemed too subjective to be enforceable. The fines were dismissed. The Rainbow House was allowed to remain. The ruling sent shockwaves through the community. The HOA president, once feared and respected, was suddenly seen as powerless. Neighbors who had once bowed to her authority now openly questioned her decisions. The board, embarrassed by the loss, began to fracture. Some members quietly resigned, unwilling to be associated with the debacle. Others turned against the president, blaming her obsession for the humiliation. The homeowner, however, did not gloat. He continued living quietly, caring for his house and sharing its colors with anyone who asked. But beneath the surface, he knew the battle was not truly over. The HOA president was wounded, but not finished. She had lost in court, but her pride demanded retaliation, and retaliation in her mind was inevitable. The ruling from the judge should have ended everything. For most people, it would have been a decisive conclusion, a moment to breathe and move forward. The Rainbow House was safe, the fines were erased, and the law had spoken. Neighbors who once whispered nervously about the conflict now smiled openly when they passed, relieved that the saga seemed finished. Children continued to pose for pictures. Families stopped to admire the house on evening walks. The street felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of constant surveillance had been lifted. But for the HOA president, defeat was unbearable. She had built her identity on being the guardian of the rules, the enforcer of order, the woman who could not be challenged. Losing in court was not just a legal setback. It was to her a public humiliation that eroded the very foundation of her power. And when people like her feel their grip slipping, they do not quietly step aside. They claw, they scheme, they find new ways to assert control. The days after the verdict were filled with silence from her. No newsletters, no board meetings, no visible confrontations. To outsiders, it seemed she was retreating. But beneath that silence, she was plotting. The HOA's authority may have been dented, but she still had influence and she intended to wield it. She began by targeting the Rainbow homeowner indirectly. She sent inspectors to his property, searching for violations unrelated to paint. A mailbox that was 2 inches too tall, a fence that leaned slightly, a flower bed she deemed unsightly. Every minor detail became a weapon. Letters arrived weekly, each one filled with citations and threats of fines. Though the court had protected the rainbow paint, it had not shielded him from the endless arsenal of petty rules. At first, the homeowner tolerated it. He understood that retaliation was inevitable, and he believed patience would outlast pettiness. But as the letters piled up, he realized this was not going to fade on its own. The president's obsession was not weakening, it was intensifying. Her desperation also began spilling into public behavior. At neighborhood gatherings, she ranted about the decline of standards. At HOA meetings, she warned of a slippery slope that would end in clown houses and property chaos. Her voice grew sharper, her tone more hysterical. Board members who once nodded in obedience now exchanged uneasy glances. What had begun as a firm leader defending rules now looked like a bitter woman unraveling in front of her peers. And outside the boardroom, the world was still watching. The Rainbow House continued to trend on social media, and people still drove from other towns to see it. Each photo shared online was another reminder of her failure, another spotlight on the thing she hated most. Her crusade to maintain beige perfection had backfired so spectacularly that it turned her into a symbol of control gone too far. She tried again to push for new bylaws, drafting stricter language about acceptable colors, lawn decorations, even holiday lights. But the board hesitated. Many members had grown weary of the endless conflict, and some feared that further battles would only bring more embarrassment. One by one, they began distancing themselves, leaving her isolated. Still, she would not stop. The breaking point came when she attempted her boldest move yet, an effort to have the homeowner forcibly removed from the community. She argued that his disrespect for authority and his willful disruption made him unfit to live there. She filed paperwork, sent letters, and even hired a lawyer. It was, in her mind, the final solution. If she couldn't erase the Rainbow House, she would erase the man who lived inside it. But by then, she had underestimated just how far public opinion had swung. Word of her attempt spread quickly, and outrage followed. News outlets picked up the story again, portraying her not as a protector of community values, but as a villain consumed by revenge. Editorials described her as the face of HOA overreach. Social media mocked her with nicknames, memes, and parodies. What she thought was her last chance to reclaim authority became her complete undoing. Neighbors, too, finally reached their limit. Many had once feared her, but now they were tired of the hostility, the lawsuits, the endless attention. A petition began circulating, not against the Rainbow House, but against her. Signatures gathered faster than she expected, and soon the board could no longer ignore it. A special meeting was called. For the first time in years, the president faced a vote not about someone else's house, but about her own leadership. The meeting was tense. Dozens of residents filled the room, their faces a mix of anger, exhaustion, and determination. The president tried to defend herself, insisting she was protecting them from chaos. But her words rang hollow, drowned out by residents who spoke of harassment, wasted funds, and embarrassment. When the vote came, the result was overwhelming. She was removed from her position as HOA president. The fallout was immediate. Without her leadership, the board softened its tone. Enforcement became less hostile, communication more collaborative. The Rainbow House, once seen as a provocation, was now embraced as part of the neighborhood's identity. Families painted small murals on fences, children drew chalk rainbows on sidewalks, and the street felt more alive than it ever had under beige uniformity. The former president, meanwhile, withdrew from public life. Some said she moved away, unable to bear living in the shadow of the Rainbow House she tried so hard to destroy. Others claimed she stayed, but behind closed doors, bitter and forgotten. Either way, her reign of control was over. For the homeowner, victory was never about gloating. He continued to live quietly, tending to his garden, maintaining his home, and welcoming those who came to admire its colors. He never set out to become a symbol, but in the end, he had become one. His Rainbow House was more than just paint. It was a reminder that individuality could survive even in the most rigid environments. Over time, the street became known affectionately as Rainbow Row, a place where visitors smiled and neighbors felt freer to express themselves. And while the HOA still existed, its power was no longer absolute. Rules mattered, but so did fairness, and the community learned that balance was more valuable than control. The saga of the Rainbow House became a story told again and again, not just online but among neighbors, families, and even other communities. It was a cautionary tale for HOAs everywhere. Push too hard, and the pushback will be stronger. Demand beige, and you might just get a rainbow. And for the homeowner, it was a reminder that sometimes standing firm against conformity does more than protect your own freedom. It gives others the courage to do the same. The Rainbow House remained, bright against the rows of beige, not as an act of rebellion anymore, but as a permanent celebration of individuality. And every time the sun hit its colors just right, the entire street glowed with proof that one small act of defiance could change everything.